try to do anything.
See, and this gets into an interesting thing where he's critiquing the feminist movement, because he talks about how the feminist movement is a neo-Marxist movement because it takes the template of Marxian class analysis, where you observe those with the concentration of power and those without. And he says the modern feminist movement does the same thing, but it just paints the patriarchy as the oppressor and women as the oppressed. And in his mind, it means that it's kind of like this is my interpretation of him, so obviously I could be wrong. But he paints it as it's kind of like a fundamentalist thing where you turn all men into the enemy, and it's about, you know, overcoming the enemy at any cost and that kind of thing. And he equates that to its connection with Marxism. But I mean, in a lot of ways, I think the irony of that is that kind of developed after the crushing of real Marxist and left-wing thought. And this whole development of identity politics and this current idea that a lot of left-wing movements have, which isn't about overturning the hierarchical structure, but simply integrating oppressed groups into it. So you have this idea now where it's like, oh, capitalism's fine, we just need women and black people on the boards of directors. And that will fix the problem.
Right.
I really think that has been something that the left has been steered into by the political establishment to steer them away from critiquing class and wealth and concentrations of power. And you see the Democratic Party co-opting all of these things. They have no problem with it.
Totally.
They've gotten fully on board with this idea. We need more women. You know, we need women in Congress. We need women in the boards of directors. All these things. I don't think that in any way deals with the core problem, and neither would Marx, because Marx talked about that hierarchy being the problem. So even though it has that oppressor template, it is fundamentally un-Marxist because it does not deal with the hierarchy itself.
So what I would say is the part that he's taking from Marxism is the equality of outcome again. And so the fact that feminists, for instance, what we were talking about before we started the podcast with the transgender man who became a woman competing in MMA fighting women.
Right.
Like that idea that they're fundamentally equal, that women and men are fundamentally equal, that I would say is what he's critiquing in the feminist movement. You know, they want equality of outcome for women, when in reality there's a lot of psychological and biological reasons that they're not equally represented in various fields. Yeah. So like Google, for instance, this brings up the whole idea of that letter that the Google employee wrote. Did you hear about that?
I did hear about that.
He's also in the intellectual dark web.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So that guy was a Google employee, and they asked him, or they asked everybody what they could do better to facilitate women in the workplace and get more women to come work with them. And he wrote them a letter about it, saying like, these are things that would help. And he was very honest about it and very realistic about it, and in no way sexist from my perspective.
What are some of his arguments?
He said that women are more social than men, and they prefer to interact with people more, so maybe more group work would be a better way.
People-oriented as opposed to technical-oriented.
Yes, which is psychologically supported. And I'm trying to remember the other ones. It was that kind of vein, though, where he was talking about these are things that we know from psychology and biology that are different in women.
See, and there is this this interesting problem with the idea of if anyone tries to say there's inherent differences between different groups like men or women, people freak out.
Yeah.
And I think that caution is certainly warranted. I mean, all you have to do is look at our history of saying justifying our treatment of black slaves for various social Darwinistic reasons.
Right.
But I do think that's certainly you can't ignore the fact that biologically there's certain predispositions, especially between men and women.
It's the thing is like I think one of the biggest critiques that Jordan Peterson has is he's a personality psychologist, so he's done a lot of research on the differences between men and women, and also just different traits, and he goes into the idea that if you look at how the distribution of, he usually goes into aggression of women and men, there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
But if you go to the tips of who are the most aggressive
It's
people,
always men.
it will always be men, and that's why there's so many men in prison. And so then he's like, okay, so
it's
do
not
you
the
want
only reason there's so many men in prison. There's
well,
a huge problem there also, but
yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it's obviously more complicated than that. Well, that's different.
And all kinds of things.
It's still men, though. But the idea is that he was like, okay, well, that seems to be a pretty legit reason as to why there would be at least a greater number of men in prisons.
Definitely.
So it's like, okay, so if we take that for granted, then we just say, okay, if you want to take your idea of equality of outcome and then you just change that to, like, should there be just as many females in prison now? And literally he says, like, he's talked to women who are advocating for this, who do advocate for that.
Yeah, see, that's silly to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Just my own personal point of view, I think that's silly.
But the big thing that I think is important when it comes to, like, listening to Jordan Peterson about what he's saying is it's not like he's making this up. Like, people actually have that narrative, and he's like, that narrative is bad.
Definitely.
And it is, I do think that it is difficult because it does come to that whole, like, he has this, I wouldn't, instead of stereotypical, I would say like a pragmatic view of both postmodernism and Marxism, where he says, well, how are people using it right now? And then he'll just use the word Marxism, and it's like, okay, or neo-Marxism, and he'll say, but it's actually how people are using it.
But he will talk, like, I watched a lot of his stuff on Marxism, and he turns it into, like, this general thing. Like, this is what Marxism is.
Right.
And he makes a lot of generalizations that obviously I have problems with.
I do think that what Drew just said is accurate, though. He's using it in the way that it's manifested, not the way that it was theorized.
Also, and I think that...
Well, also, but he's not... it is manifesting in other ways, too. It's just not so loud and in your face, and so he's taking that one to task.
I would say, like, the thing that I'm, like, definitely seeing, too, is that you don't like how he's using it because you're worried about people... Because he obviously defines it. He's like... If you like what you just said was he generalizes it and then he'll define those generalizations. So the idea is that you're kind of worried about the same thing that happened during like the Cold War, which is socialism's bad, and then everyone starts thinking that rather than actually looking into what's occurring.
The ideas itself.
Well,
too much terminology.
Trump just did that at his rally, like with the whole like cricket Hillary, but he said like, trying to get people excited to vote and being like the Democrats just want social policies, they want to take your guns away, like all these things without actually defending any of the arguments or understanding that like we have a socialist, like we already have social policies within our capitalist society. We're not 100% capitalistic.
For sure.
Well, he says all kinds of weird shit. Like he'll say that like, you know, with Medicare for all, they want to take your Medicaid. Like it's Medicaid, it's Medicare for all. Like, are you saying you're going to lose supplementary health programs we currently have in place in exchange for a universal, all-encompassing one? Oh, bummer. Like, oh no.
Well, I guess,
they're going to take your Obamacare. Like, not that he'd say that.
Yeah, there's
the same idea where it's like you're getting more. Like, what do you?
Yeah, there's something that I wanted to say about the just the equality of outcome type thing. Jordan Peterson makes a really good argument for why men are overrepresented in the highest paying jobs and, you know, like the top of the hierarchies. And what he says is that conscientiousness and just like an obsession with your work is way more common in men than it is with women. Right. So you have women that come out of law school, for instance, and they're fucking amazing lawyers. Like they're working just as much as men, which is like 70, 80 hours a week to be at the top of that field. And they're working just as much as that, and they're moving up in the companies and they become partners and whatever else. But then there comes a certain point in their life where they realize this is silly. Like I'm wasting my life. Yeah. I'm not getting what I want out of it. And oftentimes they leave or they, you know, go to a job that doesn't require as much of their life. Whereas you have these men that are obsessed with that and they use it as like this way to win the social dominance hierarchy. Yeah. And you can look at it from an evolutionary perspective. You know, men have a huge incentive to reach the top of some sort of hierarchy because it increases their ability to breed, right? Whereas women can choose. They made above and across on the dominance hierarchy. So they don't necessarily have to be as high on the dominance hierarchy to get a mate that's equal or better than them on that scale.
See, and this is an interesting topic because then we have to explore, you know, how many of these characteristics are if not entirely byproducts, partially byproducts of the societal constructs we have in place.
That's interesting.
And I think that this is one of Peterson's critiques of postmodernism, is a postmodernist would say it's entirely constructs causing it.
Yeah.
And then Jordan tends to lean the other way and say, no, it's not constructs, there's innate things here. I think it's definitely a lot of both, and I think that requires a lot of parsing through. How many of these things are results of the institutions and the culture and the constructs we have in place?
Yes.
Are those things tilting it in favor of one group or another? There's things there, and I think that critique is valid. But I definitely think if you're going to say, no, it's all constructs, none of that's real, it's all an oppressive institutional construct, I think that's an extreme statement and not good.
Yes, I agree. I think a lot of people tend towards that view.
Right.
And I think that's kind of why Jordan Peterson hammers that point so much.
For sure. And then, so another point he make is he talked about how... Wait, what's up?
It's just Will's phone was going off.
Oh, okay. So another point he makes is... He critiques the idea that society has been historically patriarchal. And the reason he says this, what he said was that, well, if you look actually in history, during all these times, men were suffering horribly as well. He pointed to feudalism and said, men were working in horrible conditions and barely scraping by and all this stuff. I think, again, he's overgeneralizing to try and critique feminism and the problems he sees in feminism, because while that's true, very much true, that, white men, whether it's in American history or European history, have suffered greatly under, capitalism or feudalism. There has also been an intentional hierarchy put into place to keep the mass of people pitted against each other. So yes, it was patriarchal in the sense that women had a lot of times a lower rung on the hierarchy than the men did, even though the men were still in horrible conditions. I mean, you see this very clearly in American labor history, where the main mechanism used was race, where they would, select races to be in lower levels of the hierarchy to keep, the white men going, okay, well, at least I'm not there. And to keep them satisfied that they have a little bit more, and to keep them pitted against each other to keep that structure in place. I mean, there's a lot of examples in our labor history of them literally bringing in, like if labor was organizing too much. There was one example in Hawaii where the Japanese labor force was organizing too much. And so the capitalists there asked the government to bring in a bunch of, I think it was people from the Philippines or Indonesia, something like that. Anyway, to bring them in to pay them way less, so to put them in competition with each other.
Yep.
Obviously, with black people, it's been used the most. That was like a huge part going into the Civil War, was like wage laborers not wanting the spread of slavery because it was competition for their ability to find jobs.
Right.
And then once blacks were allowed in the workforce, it was used still as like a competition hierarchy to reinforce those levels.
Definitely.
So, I mean, that's like one of the really interesting things for that too is like, I just watched the Eric Weinstein and Ruben talking about how one of Eric's things, like his wife, Eric Weinstein's wife, did a whole dissertation because she was also, I think she's actually in economics. And one of the big things was like, they literally had they had a bunch of the government's program for scientists were trying to get a bunch of immigrant scientists to come over so that they could make it so that scientists weren't even getting paid as much as they should be because they were doing so much development.
Right.
They were trying to keep their payment, like their wages low.
Right.
So even that too, it's like I think there are obvious like shows of that reinforcement of power structure and it not evolving. That's like what I think like one of the big things is like you obviously want the idea that Jordan Peterson gets across is that you need a power structure so that people can have movement. And it's that really classic idea that it's the same thing with like equality of outcome. You need to have something. If everyone's not equal at the end, there's obviously something that is making it so that they can differentiate.
Right.
So you need to be able to define that, but that definition needs to be adaptable. So
but I agree with you, but I also have problem with the way he presents it with that. What's it called? Principle.
The
anyway,
Pareto. Oh my god. distribution.
yeah, he seemed to be arguing in my mind that inequality is inescapable inherently, whereas I think it's primarily a result of that hierarchical structure. So, I mean, so say if we had, democratic workplaces putting in, rules that, like Mondragon does. So saying, the person at the top can't make more than 8 times the lowest.
Right.
So it's way more self-contained.
Totally, yeah.
So, I mean, you can't eliminate inequality of outcome.
Right.
100%. But the gross inequality in the capitalist system is a problem.
Yeah.
And it can be dealt with.
Totally, and
he seems to steer away from that critique.
Well, I don't even know if I've heard any. Like, that's why, again, I would be really interested in seeing this debate between him and Richard Wolff, because I don't know if anyone's ever, even budged on the idea that everyone should have more of an equality of outcome idea.
Right.
Where it's the idea is, this is, the actual, scientific, results of the Pareto distribution. Distribution. It's actually that there are a small amount of people who do most of the work.
Right.
So it's and it's not, I think it might be a 2080 thing.
But it was showing in any particular field. And he talked about this where it's so one way to deal with that is to have a diversification of fields because different people are just going to excel at different things.
Yeah.
And that's just human diversity for you. It's,
totally.
Why we did well in the wild as a tribe with different people with different skill sets.
Well, and it's why you want to also reward those people who do obviously give back to the society more than others. That is, that's what they're doing by doing that. So you have to be able to reward them in an appropriate way. And I think that's something that is such a problem here is that the people who are doing a lot, they do deserve more. Yeah. Cool, you created computers. But awesome.
You shouldn't make them lords over society.
No, that's the earth.
Yeah, exactly.
It is 80-20, by the way.
It is 80-20?
Yeah, for most things. Although it does change for a given system. So...
I think that's why we need to get money out of politics so that it has less of an effect on when you have billions of dollars, you can literally buy puppets.
I know, right?
To play your game, to push your agenda.
Certainly a huge problem.
Yeah, so, I mean...
Is that all you had on Jordan Peterson?
I mean, there's a little bit more. I want to wait till Drew gets back. But just kind of reiterating one of my points from earlier is I definitely think this idea on the left of we just need equal societal representation at the top of these hierarchical structures is a silly idea. I don't think it is fundamentally Marxist at all. Even so, that's where it's the neo-Marxist, the idea of it's about the oppressed and the oppressor, but it's not about overturning the hierarchy, which is the whole point of Marx.
Right. Yeah, I think definitely equality of outcome is just a nasty
for sure.
I think it's a good point where we can all agree, and that's nice. As far as the way Jordan Peterson is representing some of these things, I agree with you that he could be a little more careful and maybe define what he's talking about more and try to diverge from the terms that he's using.
Yeah.
Because I don't think he's thinking of Marxism in the way that you are. And I think he's picking the points that have been used for... Yeah, definitely.
So before we leave public intellectuals and political commentators, real quick, just for those interested in the kind of left-wing perspective that I'm talking about, my 2 favorites that I think are on the more reliable side. So Secular Talk with Kyle Kalinski's, I think that's very good. One that's done by a comedian, so it's a lot more commentary than news. Jimmy Dore Show. I think Jimmy Dore's great. Both of them have been on the Joe Rogan Show, so you should check them out on Joe Rogan, Kyle Kalinski and Jimmy Dore. They're great as far as commentary goes. But yeah.
Okay. And I would like to add to that I really like Brett Weinstein a lot, and I think listening to his talks is really informative. He's got a lot of really good stuff. And I sent both of you, both Dan and Sean, a clip from him. I don't know if you guys watched it.
Yeah, I didn't get all the way through it, but I started with just the whole day of walkout and stuff. So that was
there's a lot to know there. I'd actually like to send you guys a talk that he gave that was basically about like a reflection of that, and I think we should talk about that. That's actually something that Chris recommended that we talk about on the podcast. I think there's a lot of really good commentary on the left in there, and just the current political climate that we can get into.
But I am excited about the idea of these more leftist thinkers getting involved in this intellectual network, because now that Joe Rogan has had on Kyle Kalinske and Jimmy Dore, Jimmy Dore has interviewed Chris Hedges, he's interviewed Richard Wolff, and now Richard Wolff knows about Jordan Peterson and is challenging him to a debate. So I'm really excited about this kind of, richening of the discussion.
Another interesting thing, now that we're getting nerdy as fuck and getting excited about possible debates between intellectuals in the future, apparently Brett Weinstein might be debating Richard Dawkins on the evolutionary advantages of religion.
Okay, another
Sounds
really good
awesome
one.
to me.
One of the best debates I've ever seen was between Chris Hedges and Richard Dawkins. Talking about religion in general. That was absolutely incredible. And I think Chris Hedges did a good job poking through some of the holes in kind of like the new atheist movement and its blind spots in a way that most people aren't able to. But anyway, check that out. I thought that was really good.
Yeah. The new atheism, I think, goes a little too far in some critiques. But
we can also link all of this stuff in the
Yeah, anything we mentioned, I'm going to put in the description. So just go ahead and look down, and I'll put them in order that we mentioned them.
Sweet. I'll send you some links. Cool. So I think that's about all I had to say on the intellectuals. I like the Weinsteins.
The first topic.
Yeah. I mean, obviously branched into a lot of other topics, but holy fuck, yeah, we're slow. And we are definitely going to have to table some of this. So I guess the next question would be, what should we try to cover next? Because we may only get one other topic.
We're at 2.5 hours.
Guns.
Okay.
Does Sam Harris talk about guns?
He does. He actually has a full podcast where he kind of outlines his views on guns and gun control. And then he has another one where he has he has two other ones that kind of talk about violence in a tangential way. So he has a blog post on violence, which I'll give to Dan so he can link. And I think it's a really, really sober look at the world and how, like, mostly the U.S. world, I should say. But just like the possibility of violence, the recourses that people should have ready, and the sort of perspective people should have of violence and how to deal with it. I think he does a really good look at that. And then he has a podcast with Jocko Willink, which is he's a former Navy SEAL, and so that's an interesting perspective on the Iraq War in one regard, and also on violence. And then he has another one with a guy named Scott Reitz or something like that, who is a former SWAT officer, and he talks about it from the sort of like the police standpoint, and how guns and gun control sort of they talk a little bit about that, but also they talk just about how the police are thought of and that kind of stuff. So I think that was a really good look at that.
We should definitely do a whole thing just on criminal justice.
That would be excellent.
But that's got to be another day.
But yeah, I mean, if we want to do guns, I'm totally down for that. I got a lot of shit on that.
I think that'd be a good one to do. Another one we should do if we don't